Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and in Shadowlands, Mythic Plus are not going anywhere. In fact, Mythic Plus have had updates added in this expansion ever since they got introduced back in Legion. Mythic Pluses have become a core feature of World of Warcraft, and the way the Blizzard makes dungeons a lot more meaningful has been super enjoyable for me. So in this video, I want to talk about some of the different affixes that have been added into the Mythic Plus for Shadowlands. Two affixes, in fact, have been rotated out of Shadowlands, at least for the first season, so they might see a return at a later point. And three new non-seasonal affixes have been added, with one new seasonal affix that I think a lot of you guys might enjoy, if this will be the first time in Shadowlands getting into some M+. So what are the affixes that are getting removed for the first season of Shadowlands? Blizzard mentioned that Teaming and Skittish are both going to be taking a break. Teaming is the affixes that makes more trash enemies appear inside of the dungeons, and severely reduces the amount of percentage that each mob gives you, forcing the dungeon group to tackle more trash enemies, especially on fortified weeks when they are tougher, and having to kill more enemies just to fill up the percentage bar. Skittish is generally not a bad affix, at least from a rogue's perspective. If you have classes like Hunters and Rogues that have Misdirect and Tricks of Trade, you can misdirect aggro to the tank. Especially useful in AoE trash packs, where for a tank it takes a second to get their defenses up, where they're not really focusing on getting mass damage for massive aggro. If Blizzard rotates affixes to take out every season, this could be a really cool idea. Some of the affixes that I would like to see go away for at least one season maybe would be something like Bolstering or Explosive. As a melee, it's never really all that fun to be brought in just to be the explosive expert and disarming the bombs. But also Bolstering can be quite annoying depending on which trash enemies you pull, especially since so many classes have a high inclination to want to pull as many enemies together as possible, which we'll probably see a lot less of in Shadowlands with the target caps. So what are the affixes being added into Shadowlands? Let's first talk about the non-seasonal ones, like Storming. Storming, while you're in combat, enemies periodically will summon typhoons and damaging winds that'll spin around a certain area, doing damage to you. The damage is generally on the higher end, and I think this damage will scale with the seasonal affix. It is something that is completely avoidable, however, so you can't just walk out of it. It's going to take a little bit for players that are new to M+, especially with this seasonal affix, to figure out how to do this seasonal affix properly. But generally, we found for our group, it's somewhat easy to avoid. The cyclones spin in a predictable fashion around where they spawn. Very similar to King's Rest, the very first few enemies that spawn cyclones around them, they function and behave in a very similar pattern, except they do far more damage. We're not sure if this is true or not, but it does seem that pulling more enemies spawns more cyclones. So if you want to make yourself a group that consists of classes that can cleave 4 to 5 enemies quickly and efficiently, that might be a little bit easier to manage with cyclones, instead of having to grab a couple classes that don't have any AoE caps and pulling anywhere between 8 to 10 enemies at once. The next affix is going to be Spiteful. When an enemy dies, they have a pretty high chance of spawning an apparition that will focus down on a random player and will chase him down until the player is dead. After they kill a player, they'll just shift to a next target. These apparitions lose health pretty quickly. The longer they're out, the faster they lose health. So throwing them down in some sort of a slow or a CC will generally let them tick out by themselves. And these apparitions really hurt. They scale really high with levels. As for how many of these apparitions spawn, and if every enemy spawns an apparition, it seems that most enemies will spawn one after dying. More enemies will rather than won't. These guys kind of slap. They do a ton of damage. It's kind of difficult to deal with them, especially in a very narrow hallway if there's a lot of trash packs happening. So I think the best way to deal with enemies and this affix would be to kill enemies as evenly as possible. So then as a group you could deal with apparitions much easier, rather than fighting these trash packs that you need to be in the melee to melee, while also having these apparitions trying to melee you. Make it a very weird dance for a character that needs to be up close in order to be able to deal damage. So casters, I think, are going to have a little bit of an easier time with it. As I said before, you can kill these apparitions, or you can just CC them and kind of let them tick out. In most cases, we just had some kind of a slow, like a Death Knight Chain of Ice or Death and Decay with a talent, or a Frost Mage just dropping a Blizzard on them, making sure that enemies can't even reach us in the first place. Stunning them, or hitting them in a Nova to root them, or my Kidder Shot from Rogue was enough to usually just let them tick out by themselves. However, these enemies are quite annoying to deal with, so it's going to be interesting how this affix will play out, especially with higher ranks, as on rank 15 or level 15 Mythic Plus, they literally one-shot me for my full health bar. And then we have an affix called Inspiring. With this one, certain non-boss enemies will have an aura that prevents their allies from being CC'd. So it's a Season 3 affix, or at least a portion of the Season 3 affix from Battle for Azeroth, where we had those Ajara ladies that gave off different effects. This affix doesn't really sound all that challenging, but it all depends which trash bags have the debuff. Certain trash bags have maybe cast abilities that need to be interrupted, and with this debuff they can be crowd controlled. Certain enemies might need CC thrown their way, and with this buff it is prevented. Now, not a lot of players on beta have been really messing around with this affix, and this one does seem to be one of the easier ones. Simply throw some kind of crowd control on the enemy with the presence or with the aura and kill everything around it. This does mean you have to separate a single trash bag into almost 2 trash bags, so I wonder if it'll be better to, let's say with these Houndmasters in Halls of Atonement, to see the Houndmaster and take the Gorgons that path with the Houndmaster into another trash bag. This way at least you're fighting 4 enemies at once, and then you could take the Houndmaster that is crowd controlled into a trash bag that's less scary, where you have a lot less interrupt focus. Doesn't seem like the worst affix, but definitely will give certain groups in certain scary trash bags a run for their money. And finally, we have the seasonal affix called Prideful. Every 20% of the enemy forces that you slay, a prideful manifestation will spawn, and you will have to defeat it. Every few seconds, prideful manifestation will pulse with AoE, and will gain a stacking buff that makes it do more and more damage, so kind of like a soft enrage mechanic in a sense. The AoE pulse will become harder and harder to heal, so for healers so far it has been pretty much a heal fiesta whenever that enemy spawns, especially on the higher M+ levels. The ad will also put a debuff on a random ally that'll make you send these red missiles in 4 directions. Usually the game will show you in which directions it's going to be. If those missiles hit any of your allies, they take damage and are stunned for a few seconds, so you want to make sure to avoid stunning your allies. Once the prideful manifestation is killed, however, it provides you quite a hefty buff. Not only does it increase your movement speed, but also gives you 30% damage increase, which after defeating prideful manifestation, you can take the prideful manifestation buff into either a boss that might be really tough, or take that buff into a very tough trash bag that generally gives your group a lot of trouble. In higher M+ levels, you might not be able to kill that prideful ad every single time. Maybe your healer doesn't have any mana, or you were just trying to finish off a trash bag, and here goes the prideful ad spawning, making the pull much harder. If for whatever reason your group wipes, the prideful ad will not regenerate health. It will keep whatever health you left it at. So if you got it very close to dead and you want to have a second swing at it, you won't have to start it from 100% health, but from wherever you left it off at, which is a much less of a punishing mechanic than if the mob would have gotten its health full. Because I can only imagine that at certain levels for M+, if the mob were to regenerate health, it could be much worse than any of the bosses because of its rampy AoE damage that it does, which really does slap. Overall, these affixes actually look like quite a lot of fun, and they are quite fun to play through. I think the Prideful ad is an interesting but a welcome addition into Mythic Pluses. Being able to be this kind of wall for you to defeat before you move on to something else, but then providing you this buff to have an easier time to speed through whatever trash bag or boss that was supposed to be next, does let a group recoup a little bit of extra time and make some bigger pulls and scarier and more risky plays with this 30% damage buff that everybody gets, plus with the movement speed to get from A to B. This is going to be an interesting experiment in Shadowlands to see how good this is going to be overall and how the community's reception is going to be. As for the other non-seasonal affixes, I think they provide a little bit of a challenge, but are generally easy to deal with. I think it will allow certain players to maybe go for some more slow heavy or CC heavy composition, at least maybe in the talents that you choose, in order to deal with the spiteful ads. The cyclones are not really that bad, and I wonder how many groups will actually struggle with the inspiring presence, because on surface it doesn't seem that difficult. The only difficulty you could see is the different trash bags that might benefit from that buff. Otherwise, for Shadowlands, Mythic Plus is looking pretty good. So I hope you guys enjoyed my video on the Shadowlands affixes. Let me know what you think down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see all of you in another one.